Recorded Books presents The Slaves of the Churches by Mary E. Sommar, narrated by Andrea Gallo. Chapter 1. Introduction. A number of years ago, I realized that the medieval European church had owned large numbers of slaves, a realization I found quite shocking. So I began to try to understand this issue in light of the canon law that is my scholarly home turf. Several exploratory conference papers and articles received an enthusiastic welcome from my colleagues, and I decided to turn the project into a book about the canon law that regulated ecclesiastical slaveholding over the long term. Then, in 2016, the Jesuits at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., announced that they were in the process of coming to terms with their slave-owning history, particularly the sale of some 272 poor souls south to Louisiana in 1838. The story was in the national news for several weeks. And I realized the timeliness of my question about those who were known as servi ecclesiarum, the slaves of the churches. More than 50 years ago, David Bryan Davis looked at the institutional continuity between ancient and modern slavery in an effort to problematize slavery as a focus of academic inquiry. In other words, he tried to figure out a way to define just what was meant by the word slavery. There are many different ways that human beings throughout history have dominated other humans and forced them to do their bidding. But dispassionate scholarly inquiry requires a clearly defined object and clearly defined rules for investigation. This helps us to avoid the temptation to impose modern ideas of morality on our historical subjects, judging the ancients according to standards of which they could not possibly have been aware. Instead, we can analyze their behavior based on what we are able to learn of their own standards. The present work is an attempt to understand just what those standards were in connection with ecclesiastical servile dependence, and to find out how those standards came to be. This isn't a comprehensive account of the Church's views on slavery. Over the years, a number of scholars have attempted to do that, with varying success. The general consensus of the best work in this area is that, overall, the position of most Christian churches concerning slavery did not change much over the centuries from ancient Rome until the 19th century, that of Roman Catholic canon law not until the latter half of the 20th. The results here say nothing to challenge that. Neither does this study aim to describe in any detail how ecclesiastical institutions managed their affairs, their agricultural estates, or their domestic arrangements. These factors varied a great deal chronologically and even more so geographically. A comprehensive account would be unwieldy, and anything less would lead to conclusions that were valid only in connection with a particular sample population. This sort of analysis must await later investigations. The focus of the present inquiry is fairly narrow and thus able to be very clear. What were the Church's regulations concerning its own unfree dependence? The temporal boundaries extend from the very beginning of Christianity, where norms for the behavior of the fledgling Church were vague and varied, to the end of the medieval period, when secular as well as ecclesiastical jurisprudence became an international theoretical discipline. Eventually, church law was relegated to the domain of the theologians. This study also makes no attempt to evaluate how
Sample complete. Ready to continue?